Hello, I'm David Futransky. I am the Senior Director of Institutional Advancement at Evanston Township High School and a member of the ETHS class of 1969. In my job, I get to work with both the ETHS Educational Foundation and the ETHS Alumni Association. And a nice part of the job lately has been I've been able to become the host of our Coming Together series. This is the third video we have put together. They're all available on the ETHS website under YouTube video collection, and they come under the heading of Coming Together. The first one we did was on reparations in Evanston. The second was a look at the world of basketball in 2021. And this is a conversation today that we had between Arch Bryant, who taught ETHS for 33 years. Arch was a history teacher teaching AP US history and many other history classes. And with Jack Rakove. Jack is a member of the class of 1964, and he is the emeritus William Robinson Co-Professor of History and American Studies and Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. Jack has written more books and articles than we could ever talk about, and is considered one of the leading experts in the country on the constitutional period of early American history. Jack has won a Pulitzer Prize, and we honor him at ETHS with both a Distinguished Alumni Award and with the Class of 1964 Jack Rakove Award in History, which goes to a student who has exhibited growth in interest in learning in history over their 4-year career at ETHS. We taped this on January 7th. January 6th was a very different day than any of us have known in American history. The conversation that Arch and Jack hold does reference some of the events that occurred the day before. The look at the Electoral College, past, present, and future, was to me illuminating, even as a history teacher, and I did teach history for over a decade at ETHS. I learned so much. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this conversation over to Arch and Jack. I'm sure you will find it as interesting as I did, and I'll have some comments at the end.
Okay, Jack, I think a good way to begin this would be for me to ask you, since you are an expert in this area, of why we even have an electoral college in the first place.
Well, the first thing to know about how the Electoral College was created, I think, begins with recognizing that the whole question of how you would have a national Republican, lowercase r, Republican executive was, I think, the biggest puzzle that the framers of the Constitution faced. If you go back to the 18th century and you ask the question, what were the existing models of executive power out there? There are basically two. You could have a monarchy, or you could have the kind of primitive form of ministerial, or now we call it cabinet government, that had emerged in Britain really, over the 70 years or so preceding the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Americans had rejected both. Obviously, we weren't going to be monarchists. And for a specific set of political reasons, the American revolutionaries have been really mistrustful of ministerial government as it evolved under prime ministers like Robert Walpole and the Duke of Newcastle, and eventually Lord North, who's the kind of dominant minister at the time of the Revolution. So there's no satisfactory model out there. Lots of examples of how judges could operate, lots of examples of how bicameral legislatures could operate. But the idea of having a national Republican executive was a real anomaly. That's a real novelty. So I think of all the issues the framers faced, this was, in a certain sense, the most difficult. And it was one that also proved, well, in a sense, the most vexatious. They were still working on it. They were still revising their plan 9 days before they adjourned on September 17th, 1787. They had kind of three somewhat amusing and at points confused days of debate until they kind of sorted out the final version. So I think whenever we think about the Electoral College, we have to cut them some slack. We have to recognize that this was a truly difficult problem. As Madison said, the whole subject became a project of tedious and reiterated discussions, meaning they kind of went round and round on it. And I think, Arch, that leads to a second main point about what happened in 1787. To my way of thinking, the reason the framers adopted the system that later came to be known as the Electoral College, that term does not appear in the Constitution itself. It's a term of later invention. It was not that it was an inherently attractive proposition in its own right. It's not that they said, obviously, this is the best way to do it. It's rather that there were killer objections, really strong objections against the other two modes of election. And I can go to that in more detail if you want. I mean, but so one is, you want me to do that, Arch? We can.
Yeah, I think you should go that into more detail.
Okay. So I'll just say, so keep, when you want to interrupt, let me know, or start with your answers.
So far, I don't feel that need.
Okay. So there were two other obvious modes of election. The first, which James Wilson, in particular from Pennsylvania, liked especially, would have been to have a popular vote to elect the president. If you have a popular vote, if that's your method, you have to recognize that the election is going to take place in one constituency. Let's call it, just for reasons of convenience, why don't we call it the United States of America? That term will come in handy. So you could have a popular vote, and Wilson and a couple other delegates, Madison first somewhat reluctantly and then with more enthusiasm, endorsed it. But it faced two problems. The first was essentially a sectional problem. If you have a national popular vote where every citizen, the vote of every citizen has the same weight wherever it was cast, and again, there's just one constituency, there will be a big regional disadvantage in the South. Because though it varies state by state, a significant chunk, of the Southern population, up to close to 50, still close to 50%, just below 50% in South Carolina, probably more like 30, 35, 40% in Virginia and so on. A significant chunk of the population would be composed of African-American slaves, who of course have no political existence at all. They're not citizens, obviously. They have, they're not even, they're legally identified for multiple purposes. So in that sense, the South is going to face a big regional disadvantage. A larger percentage of the free population is going to be voting in the North than the South. So that's one objection. I don't think it was the decisive one. The second one, I think, is the more interesting one. It's that it was very hard to imagine how you identify, to use the kind of 18th century term, how you identify truly national characters. You'd have to assume there'd be a lot of favorite son voting. You'd have a lot of concerns about how about well-informed ordinary citizens would be about who was actually qualified to hold the nation's highest office. So those are two very strong objections. So that takes care of one objection. That takes care of one possible. At least that's the animus against one possible answer to the problem. The second possibility would be that you could have election by Congress. If you have election by Congress, that solves your information problem. By definition, I mean, this may sound a little counterintuitive to say today, but by definition, no one can be better informed than members of Congress. I mean, they are, by definition, your national political elite, right? I mean, how do you get to Congress? If you're in Congress, you're supposed to know more than anybody else about public affairs. Or if you didn't know it when you came in, you're supposed to learn it once you're there. So you kind of solve the information problem. The problem here, though, is remember the framers wanted the executive to be independent of the legislature. And they also thought that the promise of re-election would be a great incentive to the best kind of behavior. If you had, the problem with this is if the president's going to be elected by Congress and you want the president to be independent of the legislature, then you have to limit the president to a single term. Because if he's going to serve 2 terms, he'll wind up being, to use their language, the tool or the lackey or a toady to dominant factions in Congress. So those are 2 very strong objections. And I think the idea of having a system of presidential electors emerged, not because anyone had a great sense how it was actually going to work. It emerged because the two more plausible alternatives were, had very strong objections against them. So the framers kind of stumble around with this. Again, go back to Madison's phrase, tedious and reiterated discussions. They moved around a couple of times of this, and then the so-called Committee on Postponed Parts came up with the Electoral College proposal, and they adopted it. Even then, and I think this is one of the things, the events of the past weeks. I mean, ever since November 3rd, arguably earlier. Even then, they defaulted some of the critical decisions to the states. I mean, it's, you and I as citizens, or our whole audience, none of us has a constitutional right to vote for president. The constitutional right to determine how presidents are to be elected belongs to the state legislatures. There was a decision that the federal convention effectively defaulted to the states, maybe because they ran out of time and they're getting anxious to go home. Maybe because this is still a novel idea and they hadn't really sorted through all its implications. So that meant the whole question of how presidential electors were to be appointed remained open to discussion and arguably to partisan manipulation. And we'll talk about this later, but that's one of the things we're going to have to see what happens in the next 4 years. Will the Republicans in particular, will they want to take advantage of it? It's very hard to imagine how you could get rid of popular election today, but it's not constitutionally impossible to do it.
You mean, I'm going to go back to a more fundamental historical question. Who got to actually vote? It was the only white men who had some substance in this community, wasn't it?
Well, my feeling is, again, believing we should cut the 18th century some slack. There are 2 answers to this. The first thing is, if you have a popular election, for national office, that's another decision that the framers defaulted to the states. I mean, there were discussions in Philadelphia and Madison, who I sometimes call my alter ego because I've written so much about him. Madison wanted to perhaps restrict the franchise, the right to vote, to what we call the 18th century freeholders, meaning property holding white men, or maybe having what's called in English usage a 40-shilling freehold, was the term used there. Problem was, it's hard. You could not do that. It's hard to do that on a national basis because that's going to be tied. Anything tied to the value of property may vary a lot, from state to state, or from city to countryside. So it would be hard to come up with a uniform rule. So that's the decision. The key test here is who's eligible to vote for the House of Representatives. What the framers decided is the eligible voters for the federal House of Representatives will be whoever's eligible to vote for the state, for the lower house of the state legislature. So in effect, the federal electorate builds upon the state electorate. The other thing I'll say is, by 18th century standards, if we look backwards, we say, well, of course, obviously, slaves don't vote. Women outside New Jersey, the special circumstances in Jersey that allowed some women to vote, for about 25 years after independence, women don't vote. But I think by 18th century standards, I think what the Americans are doing was still pretty advanced. I mean, access to land in 18th century America was not that difficult. And it's not clear that anyone was really enforcing property restrictions very carefully. I mean, the desire to enforce restrictions depends on whether or not you have competitive elections. To have competitive elections, in some ways, you really need to develop political parties. You need to have kind of systemic or systematic political competition. It takes a while to develop that. So I think on the whole, it's not our image of what an electorate ought to be. It's not nearly as democratic or egalitarian as ours has become. But, if you think historically, as I tend to do being an 18th century historian, I think we should cut them some slack.
Since you're restricting who can vote, or at least the states are going to be restricting who can vote. And the states have the final say in this, as we know only too well after last night, if anybody didn't know it before. Once the voting has happened and you have elected people, how were the people who got to vote for the presidency, the actual members of the Electoral College? How was the conception? How were they determined, for example, in George Washington's first election, as opposed to 3 elections later when Jefferson and Adams, 2 elections later, were running against each other, and it was totally different, obviously.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story about how this evolves. Under Washington, I think, oh God, I really have to go back and check. I think they were primarily appointed by the state legislatures. But again, it varies by state to state. It doesn't matter under Washington. Whatever rules you have with Washington, you're always going to get the same result.
Yeah.
As long as Washington's...
It's going to be Washington. Yeah.
Washington's going to be elected. So I think the key fact there is once you have a contested election in 1796, when Washington, who'd been longing to go back to Mount Vernon, when Washington says, I'm going to retire, as soon as you have a contested election, then it starts becoming an interesting question about how electors were going to be appointed. And there were 2 ways to do this. I mean, I think the dominant models in the 18th century, in the first contested elections, were either appointment by the state legislature or elections by districts, with perhaps kind of like Maine and Nebraska today, with 2, the so-called senatorial bump, the 2 electors each state gets for its senators, with those going to perhaps the statewide popular vote winner. And I think the interesting story here, and this is I've written a lot about this, and I have an essay that kind of goes through all this, is so in 1796 is interesting. Washington delayed announcing his retirement as long as he could, because Washington by this time was essentially allied with the Federalist Party. John Adams was the designated Federalist candidate, but Alexander Hamilton despised John Adams, and had all kinds of maneuvers he's conducting to try to prevent Adams from being elected. And Washington was a Federalist, and in order to discourage the Republican Party, the original Republican Party, which is now the Democratic Party, led by Jefferson and Madison, in order to prevent them from campaigning too actively, Washington delayed his announcement of his retirement, and actually his famous farewell address, as long as he could. But as soon as he announced it, I mean, Hamilton wrote most of it, Washington revised it. As soon as he announced his retirement, both parties were ready to start campaigning, ready to start competing. And that's interesting, first and foremost, because as soon as you get to 1796, well, it's interesting for 2 reasons. First, as soon as you get to 1796, it's possible that if you'd had a popular election, it would have worked. It would have produced a decisive result. Back in 1787, I should have said this earlier, but in 1787, the framers worried that if you had a popular election, you would not get a decisive result. It'd be hard to form a majority or even a significant plurality if you had a lot of favorites on voting. 1796, you have Jefferson and John Adams are the effective contenders. And, they're both well known. And a popular election probably would have been decisive. The second thing that happened is that, the framers originally imagined that the electors would be kind of distinguished, informed citizens, and they'd apply their best judgment to saying, to kind of figure out who are the best qualified two candidates, because each elector had to cast 2 votes. And originally the presidency and the vice presidency were not differentiated. So you cast 2 votes, and then you had to see who had the highest number of votes, who had the second highest number. And if the highest number has a majority, becomes president, and so on. Anyhow, but the assumption was the electors would be a group of informed citizens. The Electoral College might originally have worked more as a primary system. than to be decisive. It might have identified a limited number of candidates, up to 5. That at that point, this House of Representatives, voting by states, would eventually choose who would win. Key thing is, as soon as you get to 1796, the electors ceased to be independent agents. They really were all creatures of party. And they're chosen on the basis of party loyalty. The only room for maneuver, this goes to Hamilton. As I said before, Hamilton really despised John Adams. James Madison on the other side was not a big Adams admirer either. And Jefferson would have been good friends with Adams, but they kind of diverged. Had mixed feelings about him as well. So since every elector cast 2 votes, Hamilton had, a couple complicated schemes to try to get somebody other than John Adams to be the real Federalist candidate. And neither scheme worked. So that's the first couple of big things to say. The next big thing to point out is from a historian's vantage point, you have to get from 1796 to 1800. And this is a really interesting story. And it's one thing to worry about looking ahead to 2024, at least potentially. So in 1796, Adams beat Jefferson 71 to 68. Adams had 71 votes, Jefferson had 68, both were majority. So both men were, even though they ran for different parties, Adams was president, Jefferson was vice president. At that time, the vice president was not really part of the executive branch. His sole constitutional duty was to preside over the Senate. And so they in effect, they went their separate ways. Now, the margin, but if you look at how was that majority constituted? Both Virginia and North Carolina, which were strongly Republican states. Again, this is not the modern Republican Party, it's the antecedent of the modern Democratic Party. Those were strongly Republican states. They voted by districts. And in each of those states, the Federalists, meaning John Adams, carried 1 district each. So if you had a change in those 2 districts, or if you had voted by what's called winner take all statewide rules, and Jefferson had taken, if they had a different mode of election, if they'd done it that way, Jefferson would have been president and Adams would have been a 3rd-term vice president behind him. So looking ahead to 1800, the Republicans started wanting to manipulate the rules. Big change, I think, took place in Virginia. Virginia had a district system. They went to a popular vote, winner take all statewide vote. It's essentially what we have today, unless you live in Maine or Nebraska. Massachusetts, which of course was John Adams' home state, Massachusetts was strongly Federalist, but Massachusetts also had used a district system. But there were a couple districts up on the North Shore. If you ever lived in Boston, you might say the North Shore, up on the North Shore, where you could have a couple of Republican districts. So the Massachusetts General Court, which is the Massachusetts legislature, got rid of the district rule and decided that they would vote, that the legislature would appoint all the electors. So Adams would get all of Massachusetts electors. Hamilton learns of this. And so Hamilton, of course, became a New Yorker after his West Indian origins. So New York also had legislative appointment. But in the spring elections of 1800, Aaron Burr, who's kind of, the local Republican Party boss, not really a Richard J. Daley, but, someone in that character. Burr, secured a Republican majority in the New York legislature. So at this point, Hamilton wrote Governor John Jay. Jay had been the first Chief Justice of the United States. Now he's governor of New York. Says you have to call the legislature back into special session. We have to abandon the legislative election. If we go to a district election, we can pick up a few votes for the Federalists here. And John Jay never answered Hamilton. He just died in his letter. So Mr. Hamilton making a party request, which was kind of beneath my dignity or whatever to subscribe to. But it shows how partisan calculation was it's a really interesting stage in the development of party competition to show how the ability to manipulate the rules. Now, the whole electoral college system became amenable to that. Eventually, what you get, it takes a couple more decades. Eventually, you get what becomes what a political scientist would call the equilibrial condition. I mean, once you attain it, it's going to be stable over time. That we now have statewide vote, popular vote, winner take all. It takes some decades to work this out, but it takes place out of this kind of a highly partisan environment where you're actively trying to think about how to manipulate the rules.
I think that the fact that it took so long to work it out is worth all of us remembering that
Right.
the Electoral College does evolve and change how it functions over time and how it gets to exist in the first place at the state level, anyway. And the next time, it seems to me that there was a big fuss about all of this. It was worth pointing out, I think, that Jackson, in many ways, not Jackson, Adams, in many ways, his administration, as he left office, he was convinced that Jefferson and that group of founders was going to destroy the country that he and they had all founded together. And so he took the step of packing the Supreme Court, or the courts at all levels, with Federalist appointees to last the next generation or so, since they could all serve for life. And that's not too different than what's happened in the last in Congress recently, as the Republicans in
Right.
control of the Senate wouldn't appoint judges appointed by appointed by the president. They wouldn't support those by a Democratic president. So all of a sudden you can say, and it's true, that the number of judges that President Trump has appointed is huge because there were so many vacancies left by the 8 years of Obama's presidency that he had tried to appoint someone, but the Republicans in the Senate wouldn't do it. So, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that there is that power that the president has to this day that's in the original Constitution. That the next time there was a true crisis with the Electoral College, other than ignoring the outbreak of the Civil War, would have been 1876.
Well, no, I think you actually have to say 1824.
1824. Oh, yes, because yes, good point.
The point about the election of 1800 we forget,
Yes.
that I think is worth noting is how much how the party started realizing that the rules are there not just to be deployed, but to be manipulated.
It's probably worth reminding everybody that the Constitution makes no provision for the existence of political parties because the founders were hoping we wouldn't have political parties.
Right.
But they split apart immediately. So that's
Right. Of course, the other big outcome of the election of 1800, really you should say the election of 1800, 1801, because the election is not over until the House of Representatives, after 35 ballots, went with Jefferson. There's this whole question of whether the Federalists actually had to swing votes in it was a lame duck session of the old House of Representatives, but that was the House that was going to decide who would be president. And there's this whole complicated set of stories about would it be better to make a deal with Burr or to go with Jefferson. Hamilton was still kind of the dominant political figure. Had a terrible personal aversion to Burr, and everybody who's seen the Hamilton musical, which I saw in Chicago 2 years ago, knows why that was the case. Hamilton despised Madison in theory. Hamilton distrusted Madison in theory, but Burr he really despised as a person. In the end, Hamilton decided that Jefferson, was the better bet. But the other big outcome, of course, the reason the election went into the House was that there was a tied vote between Jefferson and Burr, who were running mates. Every Republican thought that Jefferson was, the leading candidate and Burr was his number two guy. But they had the same number of votes. What the Republicans should have done, what Hamilton would have done had he been in their place, he would have made sure that a couple of Republican electors threw their votes away from Burr, so that Jefferson would have a handful, whatever, more than Burr. But the Republicans were so nervous and were so kind of amped up that they didn't do that. So the election went into the House, and then it took 35 ballots to finally get it worked out. So the outcome of this was the 12th Amendment. And what the 12th Amendment does is effective. I think the term they used was to distinguish the vote for president from the vote for vice president. So now you have a clear pecking order, which in a lot of ways was also conducive to maintaining a political party system, because it suggests the importance of not just identifying qualified individuals, but actually having an organized slate.
So it's actually one of the steps we took to back into a political party system,
Right,
which
right,
isn't specified in the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, I think my own theory is that right. I mean, Archie's really right to say that political party. There are a couple primitive political party systems in primarily in Pennsylvania before 1787.
Yeah.
There had been one in England in the late 17th century, somewhat modified in the 18th century. But yeah, creating an opposition political party was a great novelty. I mean, my theory is that the presidency, because of the way in which it's elected, really is a strong incentive in the United States to have a two-party system. If we had a parliamentary system on the British model in a country this big and this diverse, my guess is we probably have coalitional politics.
And I interpret, since the Constitution requires that the president get a majority of the votes, possible votes in the Electoral College,
Right.
Okay, and that's required in the Electoral College, and that, in one sense, is a reason why we end up with two political parties. Otherwise, you will always have the president chose by the House of Representatives, because the election would go there if nobody got a majority in the Electoral College. So is that a reason for us today to continue to want to maintain an Electoral College? It forces us into a two-party system.
I think that's how it's operated historically. I think we'd still have strong incentives. The presidency is so important. I think we'd have strong incentives to form two parties. Although the Republican Party's become so unstable, it's hard to know what's going to be coming. But look, Archie, I think the key thing here is to get to 1824.
Yes.
Which is so that's the so-called 5-horse race. There's actually a great book on the subject, right? Yeah, here we go. Sitting right here. The one-party presidential contest, Andrew Jackson in 1824, is 5-horse race for anybody who wants to read it. I think of all the elections we had, particularly when you don't have an incumbent running for re-election, 1824 is the closest to what happened. It's the closest to what the framers probably expected would have taken place, precisely because they couldn't imagine how a party system would work. So the Federalist Party effectively died by 1816. And James Monroe was elected to succeed Madison. It's the so-called era of good feelings. I remember discussing this with my late Evanston High School teacher, Bernard G. Matson, who came to Evanston High the year it opened in 1924. B.G. Matson, a great teacher.
And who actually, I sort of succeeded him as an AP teacher.
Oh, really? Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. So great guy. His best known student was George Ball, who was Lyndon Johnson's undersecretary. He was Undersecretary of State under Johnson, was the well-known Vietnam War dissenter back in the 60s. But in any case, I think the 1824 election is the one that was closest to what the framers expected. So the Federalist Party had died. Now there's just one big Republican Party, which, because there's no real opposition party, becomes highly factionalized, meaning it's starting to break down. So there were 5 candidates. Andrew Jackson was one, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay from Kentucky, William Crawford from Georgia, and John C. Calhoun from Carolina. Crawford had a stroke, so his ability to compete, although he stays in the race, was somewhat reduced. So in a sense, and so that's, so 1800 went into the House of Representatives because of the, because of the tie between Jefferson and Burr. 1824 goes there because you don't get a majority. And so it goes into the House, and remember the House votes by states, and in the end, maybe not, some kind of bargain was struck between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay to lead to controlling. And Clay was a dominant figure in the House to kind of produce the result we got. So that's the other election that figures primarily. It's worth recalling though, because I think it's the one that best echoes what the framers probably anticipated. Then you get to 1876. I'm not a big expert in 1876. Sometimes historians like to say, we don't want to answer questions. We say, we have two answers. Sometimes we say, sorry, it's more complicated than that. And sometimes we say that's after my period. So I haven't worked in 1876 closely, except to note that that's the famous Tilden Hayes election. And its main significance in American politics. I mean, they're disputed ballots from Florida and two other states.
Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina.
South Carolina, all southern states. A major part of that, of course, is that the rising tide of white supremacy is working to suppress the black vote, which became possible under the Reconstruction governments and then reinforced by the 15th Amendment. And, the basic deal in 1876, as historians say, Lindsey Graham, that otherwise despicable character, I think made this point yesterday in the Senate, that, Tilden, I think governor, mayor of New York, was New York City was, the Democratic candidate. I mean, he had the plurality in the popular vote. But there were, they're contested slates, and the basic deal is if they allow, if the Republicans, I mean, Tilden will kind of drop his opposition if the Republicans withdraw the occupation army from the South, which in turn is what makes, the new regime of Jim Crow segregation possible. And that's what leads to the Electoral Count Act, which it's been much in the news in recent days, including this week, since we're doing this the day after the congressional, the day after the potential coup.
I'm trying to recall if the issue. I'm thinking that in 1876, the parties got together behind the scenes and decided on certain things, so that the Congress didn't actually. The problem was that Florida, those three states submitted a contested ballot of contested Electoral College, or were at least going to. And my impression was they settled it behind the scenes before that actually happened.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt it's a deal.
Yeah. It was. I mean, it was interesting how both sides fought for certain things and ignored them. The North promised to give the South, if they went along with this deal, they would support and vote for subsidizing a railroad from Texas to the Pacific. The North did not do that. At the same time, the South promised, and did not follow through on it, to maintain the rights of blacks to vote as they had during the Reconstruction era. But they backed away from that immediately.
Yeah. It also means backing away from the 14th Amendment.
Yes.
Which provided that should there be a reduction, in the electorate, on that basis, the states would lose their representation. So that that gets washed down the drain of American constitutional politics. And I think I always tell this to my Stanford students that the years I taught this, that I think the failure of Reconstruction, which in a sense culminates in the 1876 election, was the great tragedy of American history. And anyone my age, kind of coming of age in the 1960s, I'm part of the class of '64. And anybody who lived, through the civil rights era and recalls what was going on, you needed a second Reconstruction, but you needed the second Reconstruction because the first Reconstruction had failed. And, the outcome of the 1876 election is the major cause of it. And I think, it actually goes to the interesting question, who was the worst president in American history? Lots of reasons to think it was Donald Trump. Trump is certainly well in the running, but I'd probably still make a case for Andrew Johnson. Unless our politics continues to degenerate, which is something we now have to worry about. But it's the legacy of Andrew Johnson to get Reconstruction off to such a rotten start that we're still struggling with that. In the age of Black Lives Matter, we're still struggling with its consequences. A century and a half after the Civil War came to an end.
it's worth noting, I think, that political settlement of 1876-77 that the parties worked out somehow or other set the framework that you and I were born into still back in the 40s.
Right.
And it was only the civil rights movement that began to change that.
Right.
And it's very interesting. One of the things that strikes me is that much of what is being said in the Black Lives Matter movement, which I happen to agree with very strongly, is almost the exact same kind of thing that Martin Luther King was working for back in the 50 years earlier. And and while there's definitely been progress in that area, it's been amazingly lacking.
Right. Well, it's a great, outstanding issue. Unless the Republican Party is becoming a fascistic party, which is, I don't think, which you can make the case. So anyhow, we should say something about what to do about the Electoral College today.
Yes.
I want to talk about national popular, the so-called, why I would get rid of it and how to go about doing that.
Well, I'd like to explore that. All those years that I've taught U.S. history, I usually justified the Electoral College on the basis that it forced us into a two-party system, unlike democracies around the world, where you would have very unstable governments because they would have to keep a majority together of about 4 or 5 different parties, and that didn't work.
Right.
Now, that's not quite true of England's democracy. And we may well have had too long a tradition of 2 parties in this country for that, forcing agreement at the grassroots level before it gets to the national level. So yes, I want to hear you explore this. What should we do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm a big advocate. Well, I have two main positions. One, I'm a big advocate of what we call the national popular vote, often referred to as the NPV. That is to say, if I were the lawgiver or whatever, I would say, the way the president should be elected would be a national popular vote in a single constituency. So I could say, let's call it the United States of America, where one vote has the same weight wherever it's cast. When I say the same weight, as we all know, largely because of the senatorial bump, a vote has a different weight in different states. I once, I had dinner in the Library of Congress. I was actually a guest speaker in the Library of Congress. I guess about 4 or 5 years ago, in a conversation with David Rubenstein. In the big forum, the Jefferson Forum, and before we actually began the conversation, I had dinner with Senator Barroso from Wyoming. And I asked him, he's the guy who's always over McConnell's right shoulder whenever the senator. I said, why is it that Wyoming has 2 senators? But the guy was such a deadpan, I never got an answer out of him. Anyhow, so after that immoderate digression, to quote Madison again, I would have a national popular vote. But I believe this is the tougher part of the proposition. I believe the only way you can do it is by having an Article 5 constitutional amendment.
Yes, that is the only way you could possibly do it, I think.
Right. Well, I make that point, though, because now the favorite remedy is what's called the NPVIC, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which actually was proposed in its current form by a Stanford colleague of mine, but an engineering guy named John Koza. And the argument there is to get states with a total of 270 electoral votes to pledge that their electors will cast their vote for whichever candidate has the national popular majority or a high enough plurality. And that's, it's what I call a kind of Rube Goldberg, if you know the imagery. It's a kind of Rube Goldberg device to get around the problem of having, of having a constitutional amendment.
And the problem I assume that you are seeing there is probably the same one I am, namely that because every state gets 2 senators, and the number of representatives they have is based on the state's population. Because of that, in the Electoral College, because of that, it gives the least populous states, the less populous states, a whole lot more weight in the Electoral College.
Right. Well, let's say a disproportionate weight. Yeah.
And yes, a disproportionate weight. And the problem, and the reason I think a constitutional amendment abolishing the Electoral College as such and going straight with the popular vote, why I think that would probably lose, is because the least populous states, the less populous states, they'd be overwhelmed by California, New York, and some states like Illinois.
That's the standard argument. I have another book I have to show.
And I think I was going to add to that before, the least populous states are aware of that fact.
Yeah.
And they therefore wouldn't support such an amendment.
Okay. So I have a lot to say here, Art. So first off, anybody interested in this subject, seriously, should get a hold of this book. Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? Written by Alexander Kazar. Alex and I are friends of 50 years ago. We used to play basketball together when we were graduate students at Harvard. Occasionally tennis. He's a much better tennis player than I am. But we have hit a few balls as well. This is a standard history of the Electoral College. And the argument here is, Alex's argument is, it's more complicated to think. The standard argument made is the small states will never agree to it. And Alex's argument is, actually, we got very close to getting rid of the Electoral College back in 1970-71 when Birch Bayh led a movement that to kind of have a national popular vote. It sailed through the House, and it was killed in the Senate. And the reason it was killed in the Senate was where of course the states are equally represented, was not, Alex argues, was not because of opposition from all the little Wyomings and and Vermonts and Idahos of the world. It really came from Southern states' rights segregationists. Their fear was this would actually amplify the political importance of African Americans. And I mean, he has a complicated set of reasons that I won't bother explaining here. So there are two things I can say to you about this. I mean, one, let me go back to my original problem, and then I'll come back. I want to come back and address the point you raised about Californians like me. Although I am, so I can say I'm a native-born Cook County Democrat and lifelong Cubs fan. My W flag is right down here. I can pull it out and fly it for us. Is that there's the problem with the interstate, the problem with the NPVIC, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, is that Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution has a compact clause saying no state, states cannot form compacts without the consent of Congress. Now, it's true in jurisprudence that the Supreme Court has effectively allowed lots of compacts when this has been raised legally. The states actually do form lots of compacts between one another that never come up for congressional review. There are lots of pragmatic reasons that don't rise to the level of federal concern. There's no real reason for Congress to get involved. But in this case, if you're talking about coming up with a gimmick to come up with a new mode of electing the president, there's no way that the opponents of this measure would allow that to take place without saying you require the consent of Congress to do it. You can't do it of your own authority. So you're gonna require the consent of Congress. As soon as that comes up, I don't see how you escape having to deal with an Article 5 amendment. I don't see how you escape people saying we're talking about the most important office in the country, indeed, arguably in the world, though Trump is doing his best to destroy its competence. Hopefully Biden will restore that. But in any case, it's so important an office, you can't arrange for it to be reconfigured by a gimmick. So you need to do the Article 5 thing. So that goes to the question, Art. So that goes to the question. So my theory is the problem here remains is you have to think about the best way to strategize how you would make a convincing argument. And, I may well be wrong. I mean, we're in a hyper-partisan period. Republicans now realize, or you may be realizing that it's getting more and more difficult for them to get a plurality of the national popular vote. I mean, the Democrats seem to have, they seem to have the advantage. And I think if Democrats put Stacey Abrams in charge of the party, that advantage may last forever. Putting that aside, I think the biggest problem here is to understand that we don't vote on the basis of the interests of our states. So let me try to explain what I mean here. We vote here, this is actually a very James Madisonian position. It really correlates very well with his famous arguments in the 10th Federalist, if you read them carefully. So our presidential election system assumes that, in fact, the size of a state is a factor that helps to define its interests. If you say, well, the small states have special interests, they'll feel, and the Californians, well, there's so many of them. So the small states have a natural incentive to try to protect their interests. Now, they worry about being dominated by either big city voters or big state voters or whatever. The problem with that is so we have a system that says the size of the state in which you live actually is relevant to the electoral weight your state should have.
By that you mean the population of the state?
Yeah, the size of the population. Not that's why those silly, okay. The problem with this argument is that our interests are not a function of the size of the state, or the size of the population of the state in which we live does not determine what our interests really are. The interests we possess only as individuals. I vote the way I do because and everybody listens. All of us vote the way we do, not because we live in large or small states, but because we live in certain kinds of communities. We have certain kinds of identity. We have a certain level of education. We have certain ethnic, religious affiliations. Our parents voted a certain way, or maybe a professor. This rarely happens. Maybe a professor influenced us to vote in a certain way. Whatever. The point is, size never affects the size of the state never affects the way in which we vote, except when you're voting on whether or not size should be a factor in voting.
I disagree with that to some degree.
I'm sorry?
I do disagree with that to some degree.
Yeah,
one
why?
of the things, because what seems to be happening is that there are certain states which are contributing greatly to the national wealth.
Yeah.
The giver states as opposed to the taker states.
Yeah, we call them blue states.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. But the 35 counties in the country, I'm thinking that I got this a while back from the National Bureau of Statistics, but the 35 counties in the country that put together contribute to over 50% of the nation's wealth.
Yeah.
That's 35 counties.
Right.
All of them, even a couple of them that were in Republican voting states, all of those counties voted Democratic.
Yeah,
one of the things, see, I think that reflects what's happening is in the country as a whole right now is that the nature of our modern economy is causing some areas to become winners and the remaining areas to become losers. They're aware of the fact that their kids are not coming back. They're aware of the fact that the neighboring town has died. All this kind of thing. So I think underlying all of this is people's perception of what is going on in their area. And I think the perception that many of, as a non-Trump supporter, I think the perception that many non-Trump supporters have is right in the sense that they feel like something is wrong with where they are, that things are not going right.
Yeah, right, Arch, but I agree with everything you said, but that's a very Madisonian position. You're saying, it has nothing at all to do with it has nothing to do with the size of the population of the state. You're saying,
no, although in effect, it's mostly the small states, the least populous states that are losing.
Urban areas tend to be, doesn't matter, it doesn't matter whether you live in Texas, California, New York, or North Carolina. Urban area, you're really voting on the basis of, first and foremost, probably of economic interest. That would be a great Madisonian position. Go back to Federalist 10, and you look at his classic statement about the theory of faction. The point is, those are the real interests. They have nothing at all to do with the nature of the state in which you live. They have to do with the nature of your community. They have to do with the nature of your economy. But again, you have to go back to core proposition is the Electoral College is based on the idea that states as states, states qua states, are the fundamental units that determine our political interests. That's simply not true empirically. What's true empirically is the way in which local economies, societies, cultures develop. And those are the material factors. I mean, look, I've lived and voted in Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, California. Did I vote in Pennsylvania? No, I wasn't old enough to vote in Pennsylvania when I went to college there. But my interests my interests are not a function of which of those states I live in. My interests are a function of my core beliefs, which I carry with me as an individual wherever I move. Now, it might be that I would move to a different kind of community and some new issue would come up. It could be, let's say, environmental in nature that would kind of really ramp up. But the point is, our whole system is based on this crazy geography about the states.
And I think that, yes, I'm not disagreeing with anything you say there, but I think what tends to happen to people as the area they are living in changes. I mean, I do RAGBRAI every year. That's a bicycle ride across Iowa. It's a week-long bicycle. And Iowa is full of towns that aren't anymore.
Right.
And they are full of towns that are in the process of becoming aren't anymore.
Right.
And on the other hand, there are some, the larger ones, industry is moving there. Things are happening that are keeping some places alive and causing the population of other places to move to those places where something is happening that is keeping them alive. And that changes the people's perception of how they feel about reality.
Well, look, Art, so my theory about how do you strategize in art, because I do think this is a political change we really need. I think the presidency has been in a real crisis ever since the Clinton years. I mean, Trump is far and away the worst example of it. But I think in fact, I've often felt there's been an effort that every president since Clinton has had attacks on his legitimacy for different reasons. And since we have to wrap up in a few minutes, I won't go into this. But I happen to think having a national popular vote where every vote has the same weight wherever it's cast would have a couple advantages. I think it would help.
Well, I agree completely. I'm not disagreeing with that.
Okay. Well, let me explain. But I think it would help to re-legitimize the presidency. It will conform to the core democratic principle: one person, one vote. Every vote should have the same weight wherever it's cast. And I think it would make the presidency a healthier office. But look, another example of this. I mean, suppose I've done a lot of work on the Second Amendment. I mean, I wrote a big brief in D.C. versus Heller, which Justice Stevens, like me, a Cubs fan, also like Merrick Garland, another Cubs fan.
Well, he was a Chicagoan.
I know, that's why I'm saying this.
Stevens.
It happened to like. But look, if I'm a strong Second Amendment guy, if that's my dominant issue, or if I believe strongly in either the right to life or abortion, I will carry those beliefs with me wherever I go.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with that. I think I'm coming from the position of how hard is it going to be to actually change the Constitution?
Well, I think so. So one way I would try
and that may be a temporary problem right now. It may disappear as time goes by.
No, I think, look, when I say I think you need to strategize, since I think the NPVIC, I don't think the Interstate Compact will work. I think it has serious fatal constitutional flaws. But I very much believe we should have a national, the president selected by national popular vote.
I agree with both those statements.
I think one way to strategize this, I would agree with everything you said. I mean, small town, rural America is in a lot of ways is dying. Some aspects of its, mortality you can't really avoid. I mean, there's, some causes may be overdetermined. But it seems to me that trying to identify what are the core interests of those states that need to be addressed. I mean, medical care would be one great example. I mean, how do you provide adequate medical care? I mean, it's going to, it's one issue actually with the pandemic, getting the vaccine out, particularly the Pfizer version, where you need this, this kind of super low temperature to keep it stable. Getting that distributed across the countryside is a serious problem. I mean, there are lots of issues one needs to think about. So I like to try to imagine that in terms of dealing with those kinds of anxieties, you might want to have a comprehensive program. You might want to tie the constitutional change, which I think we need for its own sake, to some other set of issues that would assuage, that would kind of allay the anxieties of people like that. So this has been fun.
I hear what you're saying there. I just worry about what some flag words mean to certain people and how that affects how they vote.
No, I agree. It's, and I think, but I think fundamentally the idea that one vote should have the same weight wherever it's cast.
Yes.
I also happen to think, we haven't talked about this issue, but one of the main objections to our current presidential election system is the whole problem of battleground states, which is simply a function of how competitive they are. I mean, it seems to me that if people say, well, if you have a national popular vote, people spend all their time in New York, Chicago, LA, the Bay Area, Houston, and so on. I happen to think that the parties would strategize. I mean, if one vote has the same weight wherever it's cast, if you have a competitive election, you want to do everything possible to get as many votes as you can. So
and TV reaches everybody.
You come up with it. You come up with you're trying to maximize your electorate. Okay.
My point by that was television reaches everybody, whether you're in a big city or a small
Well, it's not
town.
just TV anymore. Yeah, but TV minutes are more expensive in some areas.
Yes, and the internet and all that stuff reaches everybody. Yeah.
Whew, that was amazing. I learned so much from listening to Arch and Jack talk, and I can't thank them enough on behalf of the ETHS Alumni Association and on behalf of all of you, our alumni, our community, particularly our students and teachers, who I know are going to find this a most interesting session. I hope you'll tune in and look at this, go back and look at the others if you missed them, and be ready for our February session, which is going to take a look at healthcare policy in the United States, where it needs to change to meet a pandemic. We have so many alumni who are in public health policy, who do great work in public health or in health in general. And we have people who look at it from a variety of perspectives. We're going to bring a number of them together for you next month. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, you can support us through supporteths.org, where you can help the ETHS Foundation meet its goals. And you can always give us your comments at the Alumni Association page on the eths.k12.il.us website. There is a tab for alumni. We'd love to hear your comments on this and other shows, and we'd love to hear ideas for shows that you'd love us to present. Thanks so much. Stay well. We'll see you soon.